welcome back. So glad you could be here for day 15. We're getting closer and closer to Christmas. But you know, in Narnia, so far, it's always been winter and never Christmas yet. So we're going to see what happens next. Now we're in chapter 10, day 15. And this chapter is titled, The Spell Begins to Break. Okay. Now we must go back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the 3 other children. As soon as Mr. Beaver said, "There's no time to lose," everyone began bundling themselves into coats except Mrs. Beaver, who started picking up sacks and laying them on the table and said, "Now, Mr. Beaver, just reach down that ham, and here's a packet of tea, and there's sugar and some matches, and if someone will get 2 or 3 loaves out of the crock over there in the corner." "What are you doing, Mrs. Beaver?" exclaimed Susan. "Packing a load for each of us, dearie," said Mrs. Beaver very coolly. "You didn't think we'd set out on a journey with nothing to eat, did you?" "But we haven't time," said Susan, buttoning the collar of her coat. "She may be here any minute." "That's what I say," chimed in Mr. Beaver. "Get along with you all," said his wife. "Think it over, Mr. Beaver. She can't be here for 1/4 of an hour at least." "But don't we want as big a start as we can possibly get," said Peter, "if we're to reach the stone table before her?" "You've got to remember that, Mrs. Beaver," said Susan. "As soon as she has looked in here and finds we're gone, she'll be off at top speed." "That she will," said Mrs. Beaver, "but we can't get there before her whatever we do, for she'll be on a sledge and we'll be walking." "Then have we no hope?" said Susan. "Now don't you get fussy, there's a dear," said Mrs. Beaver, "but just get 6 clean handkerchiefs out of the drawer. Of course we've got a hope. We can't get there before her, but we can keep under cover and go by ways she won't expect, and perhaps we'll get through." "That's true enough, Mrs. Beaver," said her husband, "but it's time we were out of this. And don't you start fussing either, Mr. Beaver," said his wife. "There, that's better. There's 5 loads, and the smallest for the smallest of us. That's you, my dear," she added, looking at Lucy. "Oh, do please come on," said Lucy. "Well, I'm nearly ready now," answered Mrs. Beaver at last, allowing her husband to help her into her snow boots. "I suppose the sewing machine's too heavy to bring?" "Yes, it is," said Mr. Beaver, "a great deal too heavy, and you don't think you'll be able to use it while we're on the run, I suppose." "I can't abide the thought of that witch fiddling with it," said Mrs. Beaver, "and breaking it or stealing it as likely as not." "Oh, please, 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 do hurry," said the 3 children. And so at last they all got outside, and Mr. Beaver locked the door. "It'll delay her a bit," he said, and they set off, all carrying their loads over their shoulders. The snow had stopped, and the moon had come out when they began their journey. They went in single file, first Mr. Beaver, then Lucy, then Peter, then Susan, and Mrs. Beaver last of all. Mr. Beaver led them across the dam and on to the right bank of the river, and then along a very rough sort of path among the trees, right down by the river bank. The sides of the valley, shining in the moonlight, towered up far above them on either hand. "Best keep down here as much as possible," he said. "She'll have to keep up to the top, for you can't bring a sledge down here." It would have been a pretty enough scene to look at through a window from a comfortable armchair. And even as things were, Lucy enjoyed it at first. But as they went on walking and walking and walking, and as the sack she was carrying felt heavier and heavier, she began to wonder how she was going to keep up at all. And she stopped looking at the dazzling brightness of the frozen river with all its waterfalls of ice, and at the white masses of the treetops, and the great glaring moon, and the countless stars, and could only watch the little short legs of Mr. Beaver going pad, pad, pad through the snow in front of her, as if they were never going to stop. Then the moon disappeared, and the snow began to fall once more. And at last Lucy was so tired that she was almost asleep and walking at the same time, when suddenly she found that Mr. Beaver had turned away from the riverbank to the right, and was leading them steeply uphill into the very thickest bushes. And then as she came fully awake, she found that Mr. Beaver was just vanishing into a little hole in the bank, which had been almost hidden under the bushes until you were quite on top of it. In fact, by the time she realized what was happening, only his short, flat tail was showing. Lucy immediately stooped down and crawled in after him. Then she heard noises of scrambling and puffing and panting behind her, and in a moment all 5 of them were inside. Wherever is this?" said Peter's voice, sounding tired and pale in the darkness. I hope you know what I mean by his voice sounding pale. "It's an old hiding place for beavers in bad times," said Mr. Beaver, "and a great secret. It's not much of a place, but we must get a few hours' sleep. If you hadn't all been in such a plaguey fuss when we were starting, I'd have brought some pillows," said Mrs. Beaver. It wasn't nearly such a nice cave as Mr. Tumnus's, Lucy thought. Just a hole in the ground, but dry and earthy. It was very small, so that when they all laid down, they were all a bundle of clothes together, and what with that and being warmed up by their long walk, they were really rather snug. If only the floor of the cave had been a little smoother. Then Mrs. Beaver handed round in the dark a little flask out of which everyone drank something. It made you cough and splutter a little, and stung your throat, but it also made you feel deliciously warm after you'd swallowed it, and everyone went straight to sleep. It seemed to Lucy only the next minute, though really it was hours and hours later, when she woke up feeling a little cold and dreadfully stiff, and thinking how she would like a hot bath. Then she felt a set of long whiskers tickling her cheek, and saw the cold daylight coming in through the mouth of the cave. But immediately after that, she was very wide awake indeed, and so was everyone else. In fact, they were all sitting up with their mouths and eyes wide open, listening to a sound, which was the very sound they'd all been thinking of, and sometimes imagining they heard, during their walk last night. It was a sound of jingling bells. Mr. Beaver was out of the cave like a flash the moment he heard it. Perhaps you think, as Lucy thought for a moment, that this was a very silly thing to do, but it was really a very sensible one. He knew he could scramble to the top of the bank among bushes and brambles without being seen, and he wanted above all things to see which way the witch's sledge went. The others all sat in the cave waiting and wondering. They waited nearly 5 minutes. Then they heard something that frightened them very much. They heard voices. "Oh," thought Lucy, "he's been seen. She's caught him." Great was their surprise when a little later they heard Mr. Beaver's voice calling to them from just outside the cave. "It's all right," he's shouting. "Come out, Mrs. Beaver. Come out, sons and daughters of Adam. It's all right. It isn't her." This was bad grammar, of course, but that is how beavers talk when they're excited. I mean, in Narnia. In our world, they don't usually talk at all. So Mrs. Beaver and the children came bundling out of the cave, all blinking in the daylight, and with earth all over them, and looking very frosty and unbrushed and uncombed, with the sleep in their eyes. "Come on," cried Mr. Beaver, who was almost dancing with delight. "Come and see. This is a nasty knock for the witch. It looks as if her power is already crumbling." "What do you mean, Mr. Beaver?" panted Peter, as they all scrambled up the steep bank of the valley together. "Didn't I tell you," answered Mr. Beaver, "that she'd made it always winter and never Christmas? Didn't I tell you? Well, just come and see." And then they were all at the top and did see. And I'm going to stop there. So you'll have to wait till tomorrow till we find out what they saw. Some of you may know already, but don't give away the secret, okay? But we'll learn about it tomorrow. Thanks for listening. God bless your family. See you tomorrow.